something. I'm not much of a speech maker, so I'll keep it very short. The reason why the notice was so short is that I came to know that Frank is in Bangalore only 2 days ago. And he is not here for too long. Right now he is visiting Rice University in relation to some Fulbright thing going on there. So Frank and I go back about 20 years, as a matter of fact, when both of us were active members of Union for Radical Political Economics in the United States.
We were younger then.
We were younger at the time. My beard was on slack. And we also served together on the editorial board of Review of Radical Political Economics. Frank has been teaching economics at University of Michigan at Ann Arbor for many, many years now. Recently he has retired, but he still teaches a course every semester. He started off as a philosopher. He got his PhD in philosophy from Harvard University, and then he got interested in economics, so he thought he should do it rigorously. So there's no reason that. He decided to do a master's and PhD in economics from the University of Michigan. Today, so there are very few people in economics who know philosophy as well as he does. And today what he is trying to do is to bring these two expertise together and talk about kind of philosophical problems emerge when we do our orthodox economics in general. So Frank.
Thank you, Azim. I probably don't need to see this as well. Okay, my wife says I do. I've known her longer than Azim. We've been married 52 years. Well, first of all, I'm very grateful to be here and grateful to be in India for the first time. And I'm learning much more than I can possibly teach. But I do have a slight mission here today. I'm delighted that this new university is now adding an undergraduate program, and it's going to include economics, something I've been teaching for over 30 years. And I have an angle, which I share with some other people, that I think that economics is a social science. It is a science, but it also raises some really interesting philosophical questions, both in the philosophy of science and normative questions about ethics. So I'm hoping for a lot of discussion. I'm going to very briefly tell you about a course that I developed over several years, which I'll be teaching again this summer at Harvard. That's the syllabus, which I'd be happy to send to anyone who would like to see it, but I'll use that to introduce what this topic is. I would like to see a course like that here at APU and everywhere else. Let me say just a little bit about how I got into this topic. I was quite interested in politics as an undergraduate. This is the 1960s. Most of you weren't born then, but it was a pretty exciting time. Initially, I was going to study politics at Harvard, but I had a year, my first Fulbright 50 years ago in Berlin, and decided that the cool thing about philosophy is you can do anything you want. And so I transferred into philosophy, and I was going to do, initially, moral philosophy. I did take John Rawls' course, someone I'll talk about in just a moment. But because I was pretty good at math, I got dragooned into being the assistant for mathematical logic and did that for some time. But I started teaching in philosophy at Indiana, mainly philosophy of science, philosophy of mathematics. But that was then in the 70s. That was pretty exciting too, politically. And after a while, I actually left academia, and I was a labor organizer for 7 years. I'm probably the only person you're ever going to meet who has 2 PhDs and can drive an 18-wheeler. But I got blackballed. I don't know if that's in English. I could not stay in the union. Nobody would touch me. So if you can't do anything else, you go to academia. And I went back and did a PhD in econ. But I've maintained my interest in these philosophical questions, and that led to the development of this course. I won't go through all of this, but give it a start to structure, I hope, some discussion. I've got to remember, I'm a Mac person, so I get a little confused here. There's a short description of the course here, and I'll quickly run through that and then look at some more of the details. Any area of human endeavor and any area of academic area, including economics, there are a whole lot of what are in fact philosophical questions there. They're almost always ignored. Economists don't like to think about these questions. If you're doing philosophy of mathematics, most mathematicians would rather not think about the philosophical questions, like what is the ontological status of numbers. So this course is designed to force economists, in this case upper-level undergraduates, to think about some of these questions. There is a journal called Economics and Philosophy that I was one of the co-founders of a long time ago. So 3 areas that I focus on in this course. I'll say a little bit about all of them, but focus mainly on the last one, which is about the normative questions. Questions about the scientific status of economics. In economics and in other sciences, we build models. They're abstract formal structures, and the idea is that models are supposed to explain how reality works. But there seems to be a problem that distinguishes, say, models in physics from models in economics. Models in physics, we hope, are true. We often find out they're not. We change them, refine them, make them better, but we'd like to think that as best we can do, that's a true description of reality. Models in economics are all false. We know that. You have counterexamples to every generalization you can make that a so-called economic law. Well, why should we care about them then? Well, that's the topic of the first part of the course. What is the scientific status of models in economics? And there's a very interesting literature on this that has involved both philosophers and economists trying to distinguish what's a good economic model from one that you should forget about and ignore. Then the second topic, puzzles arising within economic theory, and I focus on the notion of rationality. Very important notion in philosophy, especially logic, which was what my focus was in philosophy, in mathematics, but also in economics. Well, what is it to be rational? In your first economics course, you get a quick look at what we require, people's preferences. At a minimum, they be consistent. That is, transitive. If you prefer X to Y and Y to Z, you'd better prefer X to Z. Otherwise, somebody's going to take advantage of you. And there are evolutionary reasons to think that we do have transitive preferences a lot of the time. And of course, the people who don't do get taken advantage of. Turns out that that is, first, often not true. And there are all kinds of problems that come up. Their preferences change over time. But the deepest critique of this approach to rationality was best formulated by Amartya Sen, Nobel Prize winner in economics, actually a friend of mine. He wrote an article initially, it appears in several books as well. He just said somebody who satisfied only the philosopher or the economist's criterion for being rational would be a fool. A rational fool, to be sure. We need more constraints on what it is to be a rational human than economists have typically required. So we spend a lot of time on that, reading Sen and a lot of the commentary that comes after that. The third is, well, I'll focus on today, and it's actually probably why having a course like this is most important pedagogically. What is the relationship between economics and normative questions of policy? There are lots of questions that come up here. One that I focused on is the intergenerational question, which put it the way many economists would, What's the right savings rate in the long run? The right rate to deplete natural resources, the right rate to postpone consumption and build tools, capital. Well, there's no consensus on the right answer to these questions. Now I'm going to, I hope, switch to just a couple of more pictures and then hopefully get some discussion. Let's see if we can do this now. Close. PowerPoint. Yeah, and then, so I did, this is something I started, I used it over at Christ University recently, slideshow. Does it go to the big picture? I think so. Yes. Okay, so thinking about ethics in economics. I won't go into much detail here. Those who have had a course in ethics that probably know something about this distinction. Ways of thinking about normative questions. Two long traditions. Let me start with the consequentialists, most familiar to economists, which was, this way of thinking has been around for thousands of years, but it's usually identified with utilitarianism developed in the early 19th century. What's good, according to Jeremy Bentham? Pleasure. What's bad? Pain. Measurable. Interpersonally comparable. I can compare my level of utility with yours, numerically. What's the right economic policy? What's the right thing to do generally? Maximize the consequences, where the only important consequence is the balance of pleasure over pain. Well, that's a fairly simple story. It actually was very progressive in its time because we were fighting rearguard actions against theological, medieval, backward conceptions of ethics. And Bentham was a member of the philosophical radicals in London who were saying, we need to think about this scientifically. And this is the first theory that kind of came to mind. So it has a long tradition in philosophy, utilitarianism, but also in economics, because the people who developed neoclassical economics were largely utilitarians. And they developed in the marginal revolution of the 1870s, when economic theory basically advanced beyond Adam Smith and Karl Marx and David Ricardo, because they used a little more math, in particular the calculus. They incorporated this normative point of view into policy questions that came up in economics. So this is especially identified with Arthur Pigou, Alfred Marshall, a little less rigorously, a little less dogmatically. And it's still alive and well in Econ 101 in every classroom in the world as a way to think about microeconomics, but only at the individual level. It's generally quickly admitted that we really have a problem with comparing interpersonally utility. There's a retreat to ordinalism. We can only say some things are better than others according to your preferences, and yours might be different from mine, but I can't really balance the two. That obviously leaves you pretty well stuck with not much to say, except something I won't go into here, the Pareto criterion. If you could make anybody better off in their own lights without making anyone worse off, do it. That turns out to be a bad idea because it depends tremendously on where you started. If you have some people, if somebody has everything and everybody else has nothing, that's a Pareto optimum, because you couldn't make anybody better off without making the person who has everything worse off. You can tell this is not going to carry you very far as a normative criterion. Well, the deontological view, of which contractualism, and I'll say a little bit about that, is the most prominent example. This goes back up a little bit, a distinction we can make in concepts really linguistically. Some of our normative vocabulary is clearly amenable to a consequentialist construction. The word good. the word bad, better, worse. Those are all terms that are consequentialist in structure. There are other terms that they're actually linguistically quite different. They're modal terms like ought, should, is just, and you could look now at utilitarianism as an attempt to reduce the deontological to the consequentialist. What is right is to maximize the good. That's trying to reduce the deontological to the consequential. Well, a lot of people have resisted this move, all the way back to Plato, very prominently Immanuel Kant in the late 18th century. So now, very quickly, a little more history, then we'll get up to where this kind of fits with teaching economics now. Political philosophy pretty well collapsed in the 1930s, 40s as a economic and philosophical discipline. It was largely because of a critique that came from the logical positivists, a school of philosophy especially identified with Vienna in the late 20s, early 30s until Hitler came, and then the lucky ones got out. Most of them went to the US, including my thesis advisor who was there in 1930, Willard von Orman Quine. He got Tarski out, he got Carnap out, one step ahead of the Nazis. Actually, the greatest gift to American science was presented by Adolf Hitler, at least for the people who were lucky enough to leave. Anyway, so the idea of the logical positives is that basically normative talk is all just bullshit. It's just people expressing their opinions. That obviously was not a very attractive position to take, especially identified with A.J. Ayer in England or Charles Stevenson at Michigan in the United States. And a revival of political philosophy occurs in the late 50s, early 60s, and the reviver is John Rawls. He was a philosopher at Harvard. I took his course in 1967. I still have the notes from that course, mimeographed, because the book didn't come out until 1971, A Theory of Justice. There's a short version of it, I'll show you the cover in a moment, called Justice is Fairness, because that's what the doctrine is basically called. That has been developed by a lot of people, most importantly by Amartya Sen. Sen dedicates his book that I recommend you read at least twice, The Idea of Justice, to John Rawls. There are some differences between Sen and Rawls. They gave a seminar in the spring of 1967, along with Kenneth Arrow. Economists will have heard of him, the two welfare theorems. He's still alive, astonishingly, in his late 80s. They gave us a three-way seminar, which I stupidly did not take. I've been regretting it ever since. First of all, every student paper in that seminar has been published. But I just finished comprehensives and wasn't interested in doing any hard work, I guess. In any case, Sen and Rawls have had a constant interchange over these topics over a period of 40 years now. Actually, Rawls died in 2001. And there are some points of disagreement. I'm not going to develop them because I think they're pretty minor compared to the points of agreement. So let's go a little bit further here if I can. Let's see, what do we do here? Oh, yes. If you're looking for something to read, highly recommended. I still have my copy. And actually, a lot of this Sen had already written articles on before 1991, a collection there. Now, there he is. Another collection you might look at, or rather, a book you might look at, is a nice introduction to the topic by Amitabha Krishna Dutt, who's actually been a very great help to me editing my papers and finding mistakes, and Chuck Wilbur. They're both at Notre Dame, which is the Christ University of the U.S. Oh, that's all. I didn't have what else I thought I had here. Well, let me just very briefly summarize this theory of justice as fairness, and there is the Sen variant, and in particular get to the part where it seems to touch economics quite directly. So Rawls indulged in a thought experiment to try to figure out what would be principles of justice. And the tool he used was not original with him. It goes back a long ways, maybe even in Adam Smith with the ideal observer, but certainly to John Harsanyi, who was a game theorist at Berkeley who got the Nobel Prize as well in econ. The idea is, what principles would I accept to govern our cooperative relationships if I didn't know any morally arbitrary facts about myself? Like I don't know my gender, I don't know my ethnicity, I don't know whether I'm stupid or smart, and so on. All I know is that I'm a free and equal citizen of a hypothetical world. What principles would I want to, when I come out from behind the veil of ignorance, as Rawls put it, what principles would I want to be in effect? Well, Rawls argues, and I think very persuasively, that the first thing you'd want to be sure of is that you are free and equal, in the sense that you all had, that everybody has what Rawls called a maximally extensive set of human rights, civil rights. So it's the usual list. He goes into a lot of detail about how we got to that list, a lot of his history, where it came from. But you can also do it analytically. Incidentally, Rawls, the initial version of this theory was done in decision theory. It was too mathematical. He realized, no, I got to write for the masses. So now that we've assured that everybody's free and equal in the relevant sense, what's next? Well, we're going to be involved in cooperative relationships. So we get a little more information, not about ourselves individually, but about what human beings are like. So a little anthropology, but abstract. You still don't know what era you're living in or anything like that. What you do know is that it's almost for sure the case that allowing some inequality is going to make everybody better off. That's the Pareto insight. Well, that raises then two questions. How do we allocate the unequal positions? So Rawls, he actually calls it the two principles of justice. The first one is equal liberty, which I just went through. The second one has two parts. There really are three principles, but let's use Rawls' numbering. The first one is, how do we allocate the unequal positions in society? Well, he goes for a notion he calls fair equality of opportunity. That's stronger than formal equality of opportunity, which just means there's just no legal barriers against women or blacks or anything like that. We want something stronger than that. And who wants it? I do, not knowing who I am. No morally arbitrary facts. Well, what would I want? Well, I would like to have those unequal positions allocated such that people who are equally talented and equally motivated have an equal shot at different positions. That's fair equality of opportunity. That leaves one remaining question, and this is where the economics comes in big time. Okay, we're going to have unequal life prospects. It's not outcomes that are determined, but rather opportunities. How much inequality? Well, Rawls proposes that we allocate among all the Pareto efficient positions, we want to pick the case in which first those with the least have as much as possible, and then having assured that, those who are better off than them have as much as they can, opportunity, and then we go all the way up to the people who have the most. So it's going to be Pareto efficient. You couldn't make any group better off without opportunities, without making somebody worse off. But among all of the Pareto efficient positions, it picks the one that advantages the people with the least and next to least and so on. That's called the difference principle. This is basically how to arrange economic institutions, and in particular the tax system. So if I had a blackboard, I could draw a diagram that every economist would recognize. Is this a chalk? No? argue with everybody or discuss. Okay, so let's pick two groups. Because we're only in two dimensions here because these cheap blackboards. At Harvard, they have n-dimensional blackboards. I'm quite impressed. And we have two groups. There's the MAG, the most advantaged group. This is old Rawls' humorous terminology. And the LAG, the least advantaged group. And what are we allocating? Opportunities to, not just for income, although that is obviously the one that economists tend to look at, but it's everything that Rawls calls a primary social good, which can be quite abstract. The social basis for self-respect, something he took from Adam Smith, who said that an Englishman in the 18th century, no matter how poor, had to have leather shoes and a leather shirt so that he could go outside. So, there are all these possibilities. Let's assume going out on either axis is better. Okay, well, some things would be wonderful, but they're not possible, not feasible, okay? Some things are feasible. We can pull that off. We can arrange our institutions like that. Another notion to keep in mind here, assuming we can put a cardinal comparison on these, the 45-degree line, anywhere there would be no difference. We would have an egalitarian society. Well, that's not feasible, except maybe with very little. So what's the feasible set here? Well, it looks, Rawls says, something like that. That is, maybe it starts about here. Maybe in a monastery, everybody can be equal and not at zero. But pretty soon you get out in the world and some people demand more. And we, without having forced labor, will have to give them more. So the feasible set is below the 45-degree line, at least in the interesting area. And as you go out here, you're getting more for both Pareto improvements and you're increasing inequality. So the interesting area here is the Pareto efficient frontier. It's the downwardly sloped part. Anything on here, you can make both parties better off. Do it, okay? Both the worst off and the best off. So here's where the moral philosophy comes in and intersects with the economics. Among the Pareto efficient points, which one should we pick? Well, we can think of some options that have historical foundations. Suppose you were a utilitarian, and it's now not just pleasure, but opportunities. Well, utilitarian would say maximize the total, right? There actually is a problem with that Benton never saw. If you maximize the total, it actually, Frank Ramsey, a mathematician, very prominent both in math and economics in the 1920s at Cambridge, noticed that the utilitarian has a problem if it turns out that more people, as long as you keep adding people who have positive utility, the total goes up, even if the average goes down. That's not a very attractive idea. On the other hand, suppose we divide the total by n, the number of people in n is a variable. Then how many people should we have? Well, we shoot everybody who has below average utility. Not very attractive either. Utilitarianism has lots of problems. But if you would maximize the total, and assuming the groups are of equal size, that'd be a tendency with slope minus 1. And Rawls puts a B in there for Benton. Okay, some other options. How have things been historically for the human species? The F is for feudalism. What point is that? It's maxi-max. Maximize the opportunities of those who have the most. Well, that's the way human society has been organized a lot, not just feudal. Capitalism may fit here too, but we can argue with that. Well, there's another one that I don't think we can go into. There's the Nash point, which you get as a solution to the Martian game, which can, depends on the slope here, can be on either side of benefit. That's interesting to economists because Nash got the Nobel Prize for showing that this is the likely outcome of bargaining that meets some very attractive conditions, axioms. Well, I'll put an R, he didn't, the Rawls point. What's that? That's maxi min. We make the worst off as well off as possible. Everybody else is better off than them. What's their complaint? Okay, it is Pareto efficient. That is, this level of egalitarianism is not inefficient in the economist terms. I find that a very attractive notion. And frankly, I think everybody in economics should at least have a clue about this. So I'll just say just a word about where does Sen depart from this. A lot of the argument is about how to measure whatever this stuff is at the end. Because in practice, the Rawls story gets reduced to something like expected income, because we have pretty good measures of that. And Sen points out quite rightly that that's really crude, because that's only a resource, and people have different abilities to make use of resources. So Sen suggests that instead we use the notion that people have things that they can do. He calls them functionings. And everybody's got a set of functionings, which is their capability. And what we want to do is to maximize people's capabilities. And given that, he's comfortable with the difference principle, maxi min. Because some people will have more capabilities than others because they're not handicapped in certain ways. We'll try to compensate for that, but there's a limit as to what would be Pareto efficient there. I think that's that difference between Rawls and Sen it's been blown up enormously. Relative to most thinking on these issues, they are tight together. So I do recommend that this just came out. It's a collection of new articles on Sen and his responses, very much about these issues. Actually, this I just got. My wife brought it. Noam Chomsky's Delhi lectures. Chomsky is another hero of mine, and at least I've had breakfast with him. I want to rename the University of Michigan as the Mandela Chomsky University. The donors may not appreciate it. I also especially recommend the work of Kaushik Basu at Cornell, also a friend, and I know many people here are acquainted with him. So what do people think? Let's argue. Actually, Sen's most fun book is The Argumentative Indian, which I highly recommend. And it seems to be a part of the culture here to argue.
You may want to take the chair as well.
All right, well, you can moderate. No ideas?
I actually have a couple of questions.
Speak a little louder so that.
So, I was really interested to hear your perspective. You talked about how a lot of problems with this model come in terms of actually measuring. In terms of actually measuring these things and how when it comes down to the crux of it, it's very difficult for us to see practically any of this implemented in actual policy because there are no methods by which we can actually measure it. So in that context, where do you see behavioral economics coming in terms of substituting for our measures which perhaps haven't existed?
Right. Behavioral economics is, I think, raises issues that are orthogonal to this. They're quite interesting. It's basically a critique of the assumptions of rationality, which are typically made in economics, coming very much from the psychological end. And I think a lot of that's been very informative. And it led to the first Nobel Prize in economics going to a psychologist, Daniel Kahneman. As to the measurability, certainly, Sen is right, and Rawls actually grants a whole lot of that. What we really would like to be able to measure is not available. But economists are pretty good at measuring expected income. And I think if we could impose the difference principle on expected income, which is an opportunity notion, it's not your actual income, it's what you could get, or maybe somebody like you would get on average, it would be an enormous normative improvement. One would have to grant that it's terribly incomplete. And Sen in particular would insist that it take into account that some people can make use of income better than others, which Rawls granted as well. Rawls basically wanted the people in the original position, which is where he calls this system, this place where you're making these, trying to pick principles of justice, you assume that you're ordinarily capable. So what about people who are very badly disabled? Well, for Rawls, that was a secondary question, and it's been worked on a lot by people who are Rawls students, in particular Norman Daniels, a book called Just Health. And so Rawls would be quite open to adjusting the expected income criterion to take into account obvious difference in capabilities. Economists are pretty good at measuring expected income, and they know about taxes and subsidies, which is the part we can get a political handle on. I don't know whether that helps, but.
But even the implementation, I mean, I'm sorry, even the implementation of taxes and subsidies, there is a lot of discussion on how exactly that policy framework should be created, because even those who are under a lot of provisions, and with the influx now of behavioral economics, we're seeing people applying nudges in certain directions towards policy creation, sort of nudging the public into doing things that are, right, for example, better for their health or better for their savings, etc. So how do you see that playing into this?
No, I certainly would. I mean, I'm a big fan also of Sunstein and Thaler, and that you arrange defaults so that people are more likely to do what's best for them without thinking. And obviously that does play a role in how the tax system should work. But we have a long history of developing what's called the theory of optimal taxation. I mean, this question of finding a Pareto efficient way to tax is not a new one for economists at all. My former chairman of my department, Joel Slemrod, I highly recommend if you want to read a really good short introduction to the theory of optimal taxation. Of course, a lot of people think that no tax is the optimal tax, but they're wrong. Anyone else? Yeah.
Susan Moller-Okin's critique on the lines of the fact that it does not take into account injustices within families, and the representative who is supposed to be, well, according to Rawls, one representative from every family is supposed to go behind the veil of ignorance and so on. So it is assumed by him that person is the male head of the family.
Right.
And that leads to a lot of problems with the resolution of injustices that occur within those spaces. So I don't know, what is your comment on that?
Well, there are three areas at least in which Rawls, the original theory was, to put it mildly, undeveloped. One was the family. So he states explicitly that these principles of justice are for what he called the basic structure of society. And it did not penetrate inside families or religious institutions or universities. He was severely criticized for this already by his female students, not least, back in the 1960s. And there's an enormous literature on how one can extend or at least make compatible with Rawls' view a much more elaborated theory of justice within the family and other institutions as well. And I'll just mention the other two areas where I think Rawls' thinking was severely underdeveloped. The other one was thinking about global justice. The justice as fairness is a theory for a nation or a people, as he put it. And he was called on this immediately, especially by Thomas Pogo, one of his best students, who's now at Yale, saying that you have to take up the global questions, And that it turns out when Rawls did that in lectures and then in a book published in 1999 called The Law of Peoples, he has a very nationalistic story about peoples being the vehicle for justice. And what counts as the law of peoples for him is much weaker. The other area where I've been spending a lot of time myself is he really doesn't do much with the intergenerational question. And he fumbled with that already. Actually, he got the right idea, I think, from one of his students, Jane English, who also typed my dissertation, which is we need to figure out a way to apply the difference principle intergenerationally, which is basically, and I'm working on this a lot, that there's a period in which societies are too poor to be just. It's crude, at least in Rawls' sense. But once you reach that threshold, past what I call the heroic age, where peoples can't be just because we're just too poor. Past that, at that point, and Rawls was aware of this, at that point there's no reason to make things any better. That is, the savings rate falls. Because why should I make a generation, 10 generations later, better off than I am at my expense, so when I'm going to be worse off, that violates the intuition of the difference principle. Well, many people are working on this as well. So the family question, crucially important. I think I think actually in all three of these areas, a lot of progress has been made. What is, I think, important is that without Rawls' start, we wouldn't have gotten off the ground on this stuff. But very good question. Anybody else? Now, I know that people are terribly busy, and this is out of nowhere, the occasion. Yes?
Question. I'm not sure if this is a question proper, but you kind of flagged the maxi-max point as the feudal.
You're right.
And you said it could be capitalism as well. And one of the critiques of Rawls is that the theory of justice has come from Marx's side, saying that the very notion of justice that he works upon is a product of the capitalist order, this notional idea of juridical legal equality. But the capitalist order itself reproduces, it's a true inequality. If you take inequality out of the capitalist order, then it collapses. So your thoughts on that?
Well, that's a very good question. Rawls himself was basically agnostic on that socialism versus capitalism question, because he basically thought, first of all, there are versions of capitalism which are clearly will never qualify as just societies. He thought the same thing for things that have been called socialism, in particular the version that we had in the Soviet Union. But he was open to democratic socialism and to democratic capitalism as potentially just societies. So he doesn't think the theory of justice it's abstract enough that it doesn't solve that question. That will depend upon history, institutions, a whole lot of things that are much lower down on the. You need to know a lot more than you know behind the veil of ignorance as to whether or not capitalism or socialism is going to work. But he certainly didn't think that capitalism was inevitably at the maxi-max point. And it's obviously not. Sweden is capitalist. And so is the US, and there's a big difference in the Gini coefficient between the two. The one thing I would not agree with, and I agree with, I think the idea of justice is somehow a figment of the capitalist imagination is just completely wrong. We've been thinking about this for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years.
The idea of legal equality did not exactly appear in the substance, with the substance that it does now. Prior to
well, of course,
democratic
the substance is going to change, but the notion that all people are equal, it goes back.
I mean,
In some religions, a long way.
True, but it's operationalization within the state.
Sure.
Comes with the democratic order.
We don't throw out justice with the capitalist power.
No, definitely not. But how? I mean, if you take, I mean, I'm wondering, like, how would you think of an equal, just, fair society within economic order, which reproduces or sustains itself by reducing unequal division of labor, by conservation.
Well, actually, first of all, there are people who want to make that point. Basically, even the level of inequality that Rawls says is compatible with, in fact required by justice, is in fact unacceptable. And the main proponent of that was Jerry Cohen at Oxford, who was unrepentantly communist, and very persuasive arguments. I don't think he really, here's the problem. How do we, economists, we make our living thinking about how people respond to incentives. And the Cohen line is, we should ignore that. And the Rawls response is, we're going to go back down towards zero. I mean, in a monastery, maybe so, but given the way humans... But yes, you're on to, obviously, a crucially important question. Well, I think we've exhausted it pretty much. And actually, the one thing I'll say, I really like getting email. And just in case. And one thing I can do, once I get, almost all of the reading for this course that I mentioned, I've shamelessly stolen, ignoring intellectual property, scanned it, put it on my course site, and I'd be happy to give you access. I'll get the course site up and running in early June. No, I mean, for example, the latest edition of the text that I use when I teach growth theory is $218. Well, I scanned the whole thing. I can give it to you. It's online. And Prentice Hall hasn't gone after me yet. Because all economists understand, what's the marginal cost of an additional copy of that text? An electronic? Oh, a fraction of a millionth of a rupee for the electricity. So efficiency requires marginal cost equals price. You still teach that in 101? Well, that's a problem for capitalism. Actually, the far worse problem is pharmaceuticals, of course. Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here and have enjoyed it.